August 12, 1958. 4:40 p.m. A Ford Fairlane sat parked at a trailhead in the northern Rockies, keys still in the ignition, no signs of struggle, just absence. The weather was 68 degrees, clear skies, rolling pine forest. The kind of day that should have been safe. But over 70 years, people had been vanishing in this same wilderness corridor. Not dozens. Hundreds. Ages 4 to 82. Hunters, hikers, children, rangers. Search teams would find boots, rifles, campsites still warm, but no people. The pattern was so consistent that the place earned a reputation not for danger, but for emptiness. Then there was Joseph Red Elk. A Lakota tracker who'd spent decades reading how land shapes human error. He told search coordinators they were looking in the wrong places, that people didn't travel downhill when lost, that they moved toward cold air without knowing it, that certain basins swallowed sound completely. They called his methods unscientific. Primitive intuition. They preferred maps over ground. Until October 1967, when 2 children disappeared within 45 minutes and the first freeze was moving in. Standard doctrine predicted they'd move downhill toward water. Red Elk said they'd go upslope, into a thermal dead zone, toward wind-shadowed timber. He was right, within 90 feet. After that, recovery rates climbed from 38% to 71%. Time to location dropped by 40%. His methods became embedded in search and rescue doctrine, often unattributed. But even now, with GPS and drones and thermal cameras, people still vanish in the same locations. Boots without bodies. Camps without tracks. Silence where sound should carry. What did Red Elk understand about how terrain pulls exhausted people into places they'd never choose, and why does the land still win? For more stories that leave unanswered questions, subscribe. More recorded accounts ahead. Comment your city and time. The Ford Fairlane had been sitting there for 6 hours before anyone noticed. Engine cold, driver's door unlocked, a thermos of coffee still half full on the passenger seat. The keys dangled from the ignition as if the owner had stepped out for a moment and simply forgotten to return. No blood. No torn fabric. No scuff marks in the gravel. The vehicle pointed straight, tires aligned with the parking lines carved into the dirt lot. 68 degrees under clear mountain sun. The kind of afternoon that invited walking, not panic. By the time the first ranger arrived at 7:15 p.m., the shadows had begun their slow climb up the pine trunks. He documented what he saw: a day pack missing, boots gone, wallet left behind in the glove box with $43 still inside. The man's name was Howard Garrett, age 49, a surveyor from Billings who told his wife he'd be back by dinner. The trail he'd likely taken ran 2.5 miles through rolling forest before looping back. Elevation gain of 800 feet, nothing technical. People walked it with children. The search began at first light. 18 volunteers spread across a grid pattern expanding outward from the trailhead in concentric rings. They moved through sectors marked on laminated maps, calling Garrett's name every 30 seconds, listening for response. The forest swallowed their voices. By noon they'd covered 4 square miles and found nothing. No footprints off trail. No broken branches. No signs of a man who should have been easy to locate. Then, at 2:40 p.m. on the second day, a dog handler's German Shepherd locked onto something 3/4 of a mile northeast of the trail, upslope, not down. They found Howard Garrett's body wedged between 2 fallen pines in a drainage gully he would have had to climb toward deliberately. His jacket was missing though the night had dropped to 39 degrees. His boots sat 15 feet away, laces still tied, placed side by side as if he'd stepped out of them with care. The coroner would later note no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no clear cause of death beyond exposure. Just a man who'd walked away from warmth, away from the trail, away from every logical choice a person could make. Joseph Red Elk sat in the back of the briefing room while Captain Harold Whitman laid out the search grid on a topographical map pinned to corkboard. Whitman's finger traced expanding circles, each sector numbered and color-coded according to probability theory developed by the military after the war. High-traffic areas first. Downhill corridors second. Water sources third. The logic was clean, repeatable, defensible in reports. Whitman had used it successfully in 47 searches across 3 states. Red Elk waited until the room quieted before speaking. "You're searching where people should go. Not where they actually end up." Whitman didn't look up from his map. "We follow established doctrine. Victims seek trails, they move downhill toward water, they collapse near obvious landmarks. It's been proven." "Proven in theory," Red Elk said. "Not in this terrain." He stood and walked to the map, pointing to a cluster of recovery sites marked with red pins. Every body found in the last 8 years came from cold air basins. Granite shelves. Deadfall corridors. You keep expanding outward when you should be reading the land first. Whitman's jaw tightened. "And what exactly does reading the land mean in a way I can document for a federal report?" Red Elk pulled a pencil from his shirt pocket and circled 3 areas on the map, none of them within the primary search zones. Cold air sinks at night. Drops 12 to 18 degrees lower than surrounding ridges. People move toward it without knowing. They think they're walking flat ground, but a 2-degree slope pulls them 30 degrees off course over a mile. Sound dies in certain basins. Victims can be 300 yards from rescuers and never hear them calling. Samuel Norberg, a field searcher leaning against the wall, nodded slowly. He'd worked winters in Minnesota logging camps and recognized the pattern. That's how you lose people in snow. They follow the quiet. Whitman folded his arms. "I'm not rejecting grid methodology because of," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "intuition." Eleanor Fitch, the county clerk taking notes in the corner, flipped back through her records. 41 searches in 7 years. Recovery rate using standard grids, 38%. Average time to location, 52 hours. The numbers didn't lie, but no one had asked her opinion. October 14, 1967. 2 children disappeared from a campground within 45 minutes of each other, a girl age 7 and a boy age 9, both from different families. The weather was turning. First hard freeze predicted by midnight, temperatures expected to drop into the low 20s. Whitman deployed teams immediately using standard doctrine, downhill toward Blacktail Creek, which ran 3/4 of a mile west of the last known location. Every search manual said lost children moved toward water. Red Elk stood at the trailhead studying the tree lean while volunteers geared up. He watched how the wind moved through the pines, noted the granite outcropping 200 yards upslope to the northeast, observed how sound carried differently depending on where he stood. After 20 minutes he walked to Whitman's command post and pointed at the map. "They're not going toward the creek. They'll move upslope, into the timber beyond that granite shelf. There's a thermal dead zone there. No wind. The rock holds daytime heat longer than the surrounding forest." Whitman looked at him as if he'd suggested searching the moon. "Children don't climb when they're lost. They follow gravity. They follow silence," Red Elk said. "And warmth they can't explain." That granite face was 41 degrees at dusk. The forest air around it dropped to 28. They'll move toward it without understanding why. Whitman shook his head. "I'm not pulling resources from a probable location based on," he stopped himself, but the word hung in the air anyway. Red Elk turned to Samuel Norberg, who was checking his pack near the trucks. "You've worked cold country. You know how this works." Norberg nodded once. "I'll go upslope." Eleanor Fitch marked the time in her log, 7:32 p.m. Norberg and Red Elk moved northeast while the main search party descended toward the creek. The forest thickened as they climbed, wind dying to nothing within 400 yards. Red Elk stopped every 50 feet, listening, reading the slope. At 9:18 p.m., nearly 19 hours after the children had vanished, they found them huddled together beneath a fallen pine, less than 90 feet from where Red Elk had predicted. Both alive. Hypothermic but conscious. The radio crackled with Norberg's voice. Whitman stood in the command tent, staring at his map, and said nothing. The shift happened quietly. No formal announcements, no revised manuals, no public acknowledgement that decades of search doctrine had been incomplete. Whitman began calling Red Elk to briefings, asking him to mark terrain features on maps before teams deployed. The requests came phrased as consultations, never orders. Pride still blocked full admission, but the numbers couldn't be ignored. Eleanor Fitch's records told the story more honestly than any official report. Between 1968 and 1980, recovery rates climbed from 38% to 71% in searches where Red Elk's terrain predictions guided initial deployment. Average time to location dropped from 52 hours to 31. Cold exposure fatalities were cut in half. The documentation sat in filing cabinets, rarely cited, but the field teams knew. Samuel Norberg trained younger searchers to read cold air basins the way Red Elk had taught him, where sound died, where slopes deceived the eye, where exhausted people drifted without knowing. Red Elk's method required slower deployment, fewer people moving with greater precision, more time spent reading ground before boots hit trail. It demanded trust in accumulated experience over institutional charts. Some coordinators resisted, calling it inefficient. But when children went missing or weather turned fatal, they called him first. He insisted on documenting failures as rigorously as successes. Not every search ended in recovery. Some bodies were found too late, hypothermia already irreversible by the time rescuers arrived. Red Elk kept a separate log of these cases, noting wind direction, temperature gradients, terrain features that should have been obvious but weren't. He wanted the patterns preserved, not sanitized. By the mid-70s, younger rangers sought him out for seasonal training. Thomas Caldwell, who joined the service in 1969, spent 3 summers walking terrain with Red Elk, learning to feel slope deception through his boots, to recognize acoustic dead zones by how his own voice failed to echo. Red Elk's maps began appearing in ranger stations, hand-drawn overlays showing human behavior patterns instead of trails, marking where people actually ended up rather than where probability models predicted. The knowledge spread without fanfare. Caldwell and others like him carried it forward, often presenting the techniques as terrain behavior analysis to avoid institutional resistance. The methods worked. Recovery numbers proved it. But Red Elk's name rarely appeared in official reports, and the origins of the doctrine were quietly forgotten by those who hadn't been there. Technology advanced. GPS units replaced compass work by the mid-90s. Thermal imaging cameras mounted on drones scanned forest canopy from above. Satellite phones allowed instant coordination across dozens of square miles. Search and rescue doctrine evolved with each innovation, response times shortened, coverage expanded. But people still vanished in the same locations. The granite shelf where Red Elk had predicted the children would drift in 1967 claimed 3 more victims over the next 40 years. The cold air basin east of Blacktail Creek, the one Whitman's teams had ignored while searching downhill toward water, yielded 5 bodies between 1972 and 2009. Always the same terrain features. Always the same behavioral patterns. Different people, different decades, identical outcomes. Thomas Caldwell, now a senior coordinator training the next generation, walked those sites with new recruits and explained the mechanics without naming their source. Victims move toward thermal pockets. Sound absorption zones create false confidence that no one is nearby. Slope deception pulls people off course by degrees they can't perceive. The principles were embedded in modern protocols, taught as established science, origins unattributed. Eleanor Fitch passed away in 2003. Her records remained archived in county storage, decades of search logs showing the moment methodology shifted, the cases where terrain reading outperformed probability models, the quiet validation of knowledge that had been dismissed as primitive intuition. No one requested the files. The data existed, preserved but unexamined. One basin remained particularly unforgiving. A drainage gully bordered by deadfall timber and granite, acoustic properties so distorted that voices carried only 60 yards before dissipating into silence. Over 30 years, searchers recovered boots without bodies there. Campsites abandoned with food still cached and fires recently extinguished. Tracks that terminated mid-stride as if the person had simply ceased to exist. Every search followed Red Elk's principles, reading cold flow, identifying sound dead zones, predicting drift patterns, but some disappearances resisted even that understanding. The land had not changed. Its mechanics remained consistent, cold air sinking, granite retaining heat, slopes deceiving exhausted eyes. Human assumptions had improved, but only marginally. People still entered wilderness believing their intentions would override the terrain's logic. They still walked toward silence thinking it meant safety. They still removed clothing in freezing temperatures because their bodies lied about warmth. Red Elk's methods were now standard, embedded in every search protocol used across federal lands. Indigenous tracking principles and old-world survival knowledge, once mocked as unscientific, quietly formed the backbone of modern doctrine. But the canyon still swallowed people. The granite still pulled them upslope. The cold still won. People didn't disappear because no one could find them. They disappeared because no one wanted to believe the land knew better.